Good morning, everyone. A couple of housekeeping points before we get going. This webinar is being recorded, and recording will be circulated afterwards to everyone who is registered to attend. If you have any questions, please can you submit these using the Q&A button at the bottom. Oh, hopefully it'll be at the bottom. We've allowed some time at the end to answer questions. So, housekeeping over, I would like to welcome you all to this Mayor Brown webinar on the Pensions Regulator's new General Code of Practice. I am Giles Bywater, and I'm joined today by my colleague Beverly Cox. We're both lawyers in the Mayor Brown Pensions Group. We've been advising trustees and employers of occupational pension schemes for many years, far too many years to dwell upon. During today's webinar, we are going to cover three areas broadly. Firstly, the background to the General Code. Secondly, the key changes being introduced by the General Code. And then thirdly, the timetable for initial compliance with the General Code and some issues involved in compliance. Next slide, please. The General Code has been a long time coming. A first draft was published by the regulator for consultation back in March 2021. That's 3 years ago. So finally, the General Code is due to come into force on the 27th of March, next week, only 1 week away now. But what does the General Code do? Well, put simply, the General Code does two main things. Firstly, it takes the content of 10 of the regulator's existing codes of practice and consolidates it into just one code. It isn't just a cut and paste job that's been done by the regulator. The content has also been updated and it's been reformatted. The second main thing the General Code does is to introduce some new content, primarily in relation to scheme governance. It sets out the regulator's expectations of how schemes can meet the statutory requirement to have an effective system of governance, including internal controls. Overall, the regulator wants the General Code to provide schemes with one set of clear, consistent expectations on scheme governance and administration. The regulator has said that it sees the General Code as an opportunity for trustees to make sure their schemes meet the standards of governance it expects. The General Code means there's no excuse for trustees failing to know what the regulator expects of them. The General Code also publicises some new acronyms. The pensions industry does like its acronyms. So think GMP, IDRP, GDPR, and we now have two more to add to that list. The ESOG, Effective System of Governance, as mentioned in this slide, and the ORA, the Own Risk Assessment. In effect, this is an assessment of how well the ESOG is working for a scheme. So you can expect to hear a lot about ESOGs and ORAs going forward, and not just during the remainder of this webinar. Next slide, please. So turning to the origins of the code. I've already mentioned that the General Code introduces some new content in relation to scheme governance. This new content relates primarily to the statutory requirement for trustees to operate an ESOG, Effective System of Governance, including internal controls, which has applied since January 2019. There was a governance-related statutory requirement in existence prior to January 2019. In fact, this requirement dates back to the end of 2005, but prior to January 2019, it covered just the operation of internal controls, but whereas now it covers an ESOG, including internal controls. Legislation required the regulator to issue a code of practice containing its expectations on the operation of an ESOG and related matters. And this is really what the General Code does. And in the act of having to produce the new content, the regulator has also decided to review and update 10 of its existing codes of practice more generally and consolidate that content into the general code. The matters which had to be covered by the regulator in the new content were actually in line with an EU directive, which was in force in January 2019, so before Brexit. That was known as the IORP2 directive, which is mentioned in this slide. That the government could have let the requirements fall away after Brexit, but it chose not to, which is perhaps an indicator of the importance attached to them. Next slide, please. This slide looks a little closer at codes of practice generally as context for why trustees would want to comply with the general code as far as possible. Codes of practice are published by the regulator and they have two functions. They give practical guidance on pensions legislation and they set out the standards of conduct expected of the people to whom that legislation applies. So in this context, trustees. In terms of their legal status, codes of practice are not law as such, and it's not necessary for trustees to follow all parts of a code in every circumstance. But the courts and the Pensions Ombudsman will take into account the content of any relevant codes when deciding if a statutory requirement has been met. And also in practice, if trustees don't follow a code, they'll still have to meet the underlying requirements of the relevant pensions legislation in another way. It's not the case that the underlying legal requirements can be ignored. There's no penalty as such for not following a code, but if the relevant pensions legislation is not complied with, the regulator can impose what's called an improvement notice, which could direct the trustees to comply with particular terms in a code of practice, such as the general code. And the regulator can impose a civil penalty of up to £50,000 for failing to comply with an improvement notice. So it can be seen that in practice, irrespective of the precise legal position, trustees would want to comply with the general code as far as possible. Next slide, please. This slide shows the 10 existing codes of practice, which are being consolidated into the general code. That's a lot of content to consolidate, and it explains why the general code is 170 pages long. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that a statutory requirement to operate internal controls has been in force since the end of 2005. And you can see that the regulator has previously issued Code of Practice 9 in relation to internal controls. And this is one of the codes that's now been consolidated into the general code. The 10 existing codes will be revoked next week when the general code comes into force. You'll see on the right-hand side that there are 6 codes which are not being consolidated at this time. A question that we have been asked is whether the regulator intends to do this in the future. Well, when the general code was issued in draft for consultation in 2021, that was the regulator's expectation that everything eventually would end up in the general code. But we don't know if that remains the case. It's all gone a bit quiet on that front. We do know that the new DB funding code, that's code 3, has developed into a bit of a saga in its own right. So it may be that the regulator is having second thoughts on the big plan for getting everything into one code. So watch this space on further consolidation of codes. Next slide, please. So looking now at the structure of the general code, as I said, it runs to 170 pages, but there is a clear structure to it. It covers 5 broad areas: the governing body, funding and investment, administration, communications and disclosure, and reporting to the regulator. Each of those 5 broad areas is divided into topic-based modules. In the consultation draft of the general code, each module was given a number, which I thought was actually quite helpful when navigating through what is a rather long document. But unfortunately, the regulator thought differently, and this numbering has been removed in the final version. There are 51 of these topic-based modules in total. The code identifies at the beginning of a module which modules contain requirements that form part of the regulator's expectations for an ESOG, and not all of them do. As can be seen from the graphic on this slide, the big circle of the general code includes within it the smaller yellow circle of the ESOG. The code covers more than just the ESOG requirements. The version of the general code that's been made available by the regulator so far is a PDF version, but the intention is for it to be web-based going forward, with links in that to other relevant regulatory guidance. One of the ideas behind the general code is that it's going to be easier to update to avoid it going out of date, as some codes of practice have done over the years. Updating is still going to require a formal consultation process before the final version is laid in Parliament. So there's no question of there being updating through the back door, which you wouldn't have notice of. It's just going to make it practically easier to implement. The regulator has talked about possibly an annual or a biannual cycle of updates, but there's nothing concrete on this at the moment. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the statutory requirement for trustees to operate an ESOG, including internal controls, has been enforced since January 2019. And prior to that, there was a statutory requirement for trustees to operate internal controls without the ESOG reference. But what is the interrelationship between a system of governance and internal controls? Well, the General Code sees a system of governance as anything which can reasonably be considered part of a scheme's operation. And it sees an effective system of governance, an ESOG, as one which includes processes and procedures to comply with the ESOG-related modules in the General Code. The modules which I've mentioned earlier are specifically referencing ESOG requirements. The General Code sees internal controls as a key feature of any system of governance. So internal controls are a necessary part of a system of governance. The General Code contains modules which relate specifically to internal controls, and Beverly will be covering these later on. As regards an ESOG, it's an important point to note that the requirement under pensions legislation is for a scheme to have an ESOG which is proportionate to the size, nature, scale, and complexity of the activities of the scheme. And this concept of proportionality within the ESOG is reiterated throughout the General Code. So there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all ESOG. It's going to be scheme-specific. I'm now going to hand over to Beverly to take you through some specific provisions of the General Code.
Thanks, Giles. Next slide, please. So, because the General Code serves the purpose of combining 10 of the existing codes of practice, as well as setting out the ESOG, as Giles said, not all of the modules that are in the General Code form part of the ESOG. And if you turn the pages of the General Code, you'll see that at the start of certain modules, there's a statement that that module forms part of the regulator's expectations for trustees who are required to operate an ESOG. And that's actually, it's broadly all schemes apart from authorised master trusts, which have their own governance regime. So on this slide, we've listed the modules which, apart from the internal controls modules, which I'll come on to on the next slide, are those that need to be covered by the ESOG. You'll see that, in fact, most of these areas are already familiar, as there are repackaging of guidance and statements that the regulator's expectations that are in existing codes of practice. But some of them are new, and the new ones are the requirement for a remuneration and fee policy, the risk management function, policies for managing advisors and service providers, and policies on stewardship and climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about those new requirements in a later slide. Next slide, please. So coming on to the internal controls modules, it's, as Giles said, been a requirement to have internal controls in place since the end of 2005. And there is existing Code of Practice number 9 that relates specifically to internal controls. So this requirement is now a necessary part of your ESOG, but hopefully it will be an area that you've already got covered within your existing governance arrangements, so it shouldn't create too much extra work. So just to recap on what internal controls are, the legislation defines these as arrangements and procedures to be followed in the administration and management of the scheme, systems and arrangements for monitoring that administration and management, and arrangements and procedures for the safe custody and security of the assets of the scheme. And all the modules here fall under that umbrella. So all of these areas are included in the existing internal controls code of practice, except for one, and that's the requirement for the maintenance of IT systems. And just to flag here, our view is that the maintenance of IT systems includes measures to manage cyber risk, even though the general code doesn't include cyber risk as an explicit part of internal controls. It just seems to us it's an obvious part of your governance relating to IT systems. And note that managing cyber risk isn't actually included in any of the existing codes of practice. So it's something that's sort of specifically now a new requirement. Next slide, please. So when you are establishing a new process or a policy, or you're refreshing an existing one in order to form the different elements of your ESOG, you'll need to build in a statement about when that element will be reviewed. And what the regulator says about this is that each element of the ESOG should be reviewed every 3 years, but not all of them have to be reviewed at the same time. There can be a rolling programme to make the process more manageable. And trustees should keep tabs on the review process by having a timetable and policies for the process of carrying out these reviews. And this should all be in place before you actually end up having to do a review. So it has to be sort of all on the table before the any reviews are actually done. The trustees should also, of course, include in their ESOG a process for ensuring that any changes that are identified as being needed, either to the relevant element of the ESOG or to the process itself of reviewing it, are actually implemented. Next slide, please. So probably the most significant new requirement under the General Code is that schemes that are required to have an ESOG should, if they've got 100 members or more, carry out an own risk assessment of the ESOG. And it's called an ORA for short, as Giles mentioned earlier. And this is an assessment of how well your system of governance is working and how potential risks are being managed. So it should set out the trustees' view of how effective each of the policies and processes included in the ESOG is, and it should also go behind that and explain how the trustees have gone about assessing the effectiveness of those policies and procedures and why they think they are effective. So the idea is that the trustee board really have to think about whether their policies and procedures are achieving what they are meant to achieve, and whether there's anything that could be improved. So it's it's really not a tick box exercise. And all that then has to be put into writing, and the chair of trustees has to sign the ORA, and each trustee or trustee director needs to be given a copy. So again, we have this concept of being proportionate. The regulator says that the ORA must be proportionate to the scheme's size, nature, and complexity. So if you have a large complex scheme, the regulator will expect to see something that recognises those complexities. And say if the employer is not financially strong, then clearly the ORA will need to take account of that, because all of this will affect the nature of the risks of the scheme in question. Next slide, please. So other points to note on the ORA is that a new ORA has to be carried out at least every 3 years or sooner, where elements of the ESOG or risk management processes are updated. You might remember that in the draft version of the General Code that was issued in 2021, the regulator proposed that an ORA should be carried out annually, but fortunately that has been changed in the final version. And of course, once the trustees have completed their ORA, that's not the end of the story. It's an important aim of the ORA to identify key governance risks. So it follows that the trustee board should be incorporating the findings of the ORA into their management and decision-making processes. And this might mean, for example, changing a process or procedure, or identifying a piece of work that the trustees need to carry out that they haven't done already, or something that just needs to be moved up their priority list. The regulator in the General Code also says that trustees should think about what information they should provide to members about the findings of the ORA. And it could be quite reassuring to members to know that the trustees have regularly been assessing the risks facing the scheme, and to tell members what steps are being taken to address any of those risks. The regulator isn't planning to produce a template ORA or guidance on how it should be written, and presumably this is because the regulator is keen that the trustees adopt an ORA that is specifically tailored for their scheme. But the ORA module in the General Code does include a list of the areas of the ESOG that need to be covered by the ORA. There's no penalty for not completing an ORA, but the General Code says that regulator may consider a failure to do so as an indicator of poor governance. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to say something about those other elements of the ESOG besides the ORA that are not already covered by existing codes of practice, and these are listed on this slide. The first three of these only apply to schemes with 100 or more members. So taking first the risk management function, the code isn't prescriptive about what form this should take. You might already have a risk committee that could be designated as the risk management function, or a new committee could be set up, or it could be the trustee board as a whole. The idea is that you have a designated person or group of people whose job it is to support the trustees in identifying, evaluating and recording risks, and monitoring and managing those risks. So risks are properly recognised and managed. And you may already have this in place, but many schemes don't. And there has to be a written policy regarding the operation of the risk management function. And, for example, if it's a risk committee, that could be included in their terms of reference. So secondly, you now need a remuneration fee policy, which is something that I doubt that many schemes do have in place at the moment. It's something that generated quite a strong response when the regulator consulted on the General Code, because it included some fairly onerous requirements in that 2021 draft. But this final version of the code has relaxed some of the regulator's expectations. So, for example, it only applies to costs that trustees are directly responsible for, whereas the draft code included costs met by the employer. The requirement to publish the remuneration policy has been removed, and the final version of the code clarifies that it doesn't have to set out the level of remuneration, just the basis of remuneration and the principles that the trustees have followed in order to decide what's appropriate. The third area that only applies to schemes with 100+ members is the need for outsourcing policies, that is, policies for the selection, appointment, management and replacement of advisors and service providers. And the General Code lists the processes that schemes should follow in this regard. And it's worth noting here that advisors are defined quite widely to include benefit consultants, insurance brokers and professional trustees, as well as the usual categories of actuary, lawyer, investment consultant and auditor. Then coming on to the requirements that apply to all schemes, regardless of their size, is the requirement for maintenance of IT systems, including cyber controls, as you'd expect, and the modules relating to stewardship and climate change considerations in relation to the investment of scheme assets. And as you know, there's already legislation governing what the trustees must do in this area. Next slide, please. So who does the code apply to? Well, although some elements of the ESOG apply only to schemes with 100+ members, the requirement to have an ESOG and the rest of the General Code apply to all schemes. And this is because the ESOG, including internal controls, is a requirement of Section 249A of the Pensions Act 2004. And this piece of legislation applies to all schemes apart from authorised master trusts. And the other parts of the General Code are refreshed and more focused versions of existing codes of practice, and these generally apply to all schemes. So all schemes will need to be familiar with the General Code and the specific elements that need to be included in the ESOG. There are some elements of the General Code that only relate to DB schemes or only relate to DC schemes, but this isn't anything new. The existing codes of practice do the same. And there are also in the General Code some different or additional requirements in some areas that only apply to public service pension schemes. Next slide, please. So when do schemes need to comply? So as Giles has said, the code is expected to come into force on the 27th of March 2024. And although the statutory requirement to establish and operate an effective system of governance, including internal controls, was brought into force in January 2019, the regulator's expectations in this area have not been specified until now. Well, clearly it's not practicable to insist that schemes comply with the regulator's expectations as set out in the General Code immediately. And so the focus is really on when schemes need to produce their first own risk assessment. And the deadline for any particular scheme to complete their first own risk assessment will depend on when their scheme year begins. So that second banner there says when that is. Essentially, it must be completed within 12 months, beginning with the last day of the first scheme year that begins after the General Code comes into force. Now, that takes a bit of unpicking, but what that really means is on the basis that the General Code comes into force on the 27th of March 2024, if a scheme year starts on the 1st of April 2024, then the last day of that scheme year will be the 31st of March 2025, and the trustees will have until the 31st of March 2026 to complete their first ORA. So it's a while yet, but obviously things need to be kicked off in order for that to be completed in time. There is actually a provision in the 2018 regulations which provides for an alternative date, if that's later, which is pinned to the actuarial valuation date, or the date that the scheme has to provide a chair's statement. And this is 15 months from the date when the trustees are next required to obtain an actuarial valuation, or when they next have to prepare a chair's statement, whichever is applicable. But the problem with this is that it's not clear whether it means the next valuation or chair's statement after the regs came into force, which was January 19, or the next one after the code comes into force, which is obviously the 27th of March this year. So our view is that it's safer to use the deadline that we've set out on this slide. Next slide, please. So in terms of ongoing compliance, the frequency with which the regulator expects trustees to carry out reviews of the various policies and processes varies. And this slide sets out some examples of what needs to be reviewed when, but it's not an exhaustive list. So it seems to us that the policies and procedures that have to be reviewed annually are generally the sort of thing that trustees are likely to be reviewing annually anyway. For example, trustee training, trustee knowledge and understanding, administrator's business continuity plan, whether a data review is needed, and the processes and systems for financial transactions. These are all things that are probably something that you're kicking the tires off every year anyway. The review processes that are likely to be more time consuming only need to be taking place every 3 years. And then there are other areas where it's left to individual schemes to decide on the timing of their reviews, as long as they do it regularly. So the initial challenge is likely to be to set up a system which allows reviews to be spread out so that you don't have a situation where you have too many to do at once, and a system of reminders so that nothing is forgotten. Next slide, please. So turning to some practical issues, these are a few questions that have been asked by some of our clients. When do schemes need to be fully compliant? So as we've said, the legislation that underpins the need for an ESOG has been in force since January 2019. So technically, you should be compliant already. But that's a bit unrealistic, given that we only now have the general code setting out what the regulator's expectations are, and the regulator recognises that. So clearly trustees need to be getting up to speed as quickly as possible, given that the general code is coming into force next week, but they won't be at a standing start because you're already likely to be meeting the regulator's expectations in very many areas, because there's a lot that's the same as under the current codes of practice. We've also been asked how the regulator will police compliance. So we don't think that the regulator is going to be wanting to carry out random spot checks, as it's got other priorities. And we think that it'll only be if the scheme comes to the regulator's attention for some other reason that the regulator will look at the scheme's governance. And in particular, it'll be only looking at a specific area, we think, and then it'll be looking at that specific area of the code to see how the trustees are measuring up. Do all processes and policies need to be documented? Well, the answer is only if the code says so, but it could be quite helpful to document something that does not, strictly speaking, need to be documented simply to demonstrate compliance. The important thing, seems to be able to justify, what you're doing in all these areas and be able to point to something that that shows that you are compliant. So how do schemes decide what is a proportionate ESOG and ORA? Well, the Act refers to the size, scale, nature and complexity of the scheme as being a determinant of what is proportionate. For example, large-scale schemes may have more involved governance frameworks that require different procedures for different parts of the scheme. There might be a lighter touch or a simpler approach for smaller and less complex schemes. And the nature of the scheme is about how mature it is, whether it's still open to future accrual, what the employer covenant's like. All of these will have a bearing on what approach the trustees take in different areas. And there might be greater complexity if you've got lots of employers participating in the scheme, or you've got different benefit categories. And a lot of this, may require tailored processes or procedures. So how do the ORA review of the ESOG and risk management function interact? Well, as we've said, the overall requirement is to have an effective system of governance. And in order to assess that, you need to do an own risk assessment to check how that's functioning and whether anything different needs to be done. And the risk management function is the body that helps the trustees identify and manage the risks facing the scheme. So that body will play a key role in putting together the ORA. But it's also worth bearing in mind it's the trustee body that ultimately is responsible for having an effective system of governance, carrying out the ORA and managing the risks. So I'll now hand over to Giles again to round off with a few suggestions about what steps trustees and schemes should be taking now.
Thanks, Beverly. Next slide, please. So, yeah, as we've said a few times now, General Code is coming into force next week. What should schemes be doing? First item here is gap analysis of current policies and processes against the General Code. The purpose of a gap analysis is to identify where your scheme can meet the requirements and where it might fall short. So your scheme might already have a process or a policy in place for a particular area of governance, but it might not meet the standards contained in the General Code. The gaps need to be identified first, and then work can start on implementation of the necessary changes to processes and policies. The Mayor Brown Pensions Group has prepared a checklist to help trustees when they're doing gap analysis. It's about 20 pages long, and it lists out the various requirements as extracted from the General Code. So if you would like a copy of that checklist, then please ask your usual contact within the Mayor Brown Pensions Group, and they can provide that. Next is assessing what will be proportionate for the scheme in terms of the ESOG. We've talked already about the proportionality in implementing an ESOG. Proportionality, it focuses on size, nature, circumstances, and the complexity of the activities of the particular scheme. So the question of what is proportionate for a scheme is going to be a key area where trustees will need to exercise discretion in the context of the ESOG. And this is something that trustees really should be thinking about as early as possible, because it impacts subsequent actions in relation to the ESOG. Once the gap analysis has been done and proportionality has been assessed, then trustees should start work on reviewing and putting in place policies and processes to meet the ESOG requirements, so filling gaps and bolstering existing policies as need be. And finally, trustees should be putting a process in place for carrying out the own risk assessment, the first own risk assessment. As Beverly has explained, the deadline is quite a way off. It might seem quite a way off, but it's good to start planning now. Next slide, please. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in this webinar, but drawing things together, we've got five bullets in this slide. Firstly, the code comes into force in a week's time. It's finally here. If schemes haven't already started preparing for the general code, then they should be doing so now. Not all aspects of the code are ESOG requirements. So this goes back to the graphic in one of the earlier slides. The code is the large circle. The ESOG is the smaller circle within the larger circle. So it's a subset, and it's working out what are the ESOG requirements and what needs to be complied with is a key task. Prioritize key compliance tasks and easy wins. So perhaps there should be a focus on things which the scheme doesn't already have in place. And I'm thinking here about risk management function, remuneration policy, and outsourcing policies, areas where you know you've got to do something and perhaps they can be done relatively quickly. Decide what's proportionate for your scheme. So we've talked on a number of occasions now about the importance of proportionality and working out your ESOG, and assessing proportionality is a very important first task. Consider how to carry out your first own risk assessment. So planning, as we've mentioned already, is going to be important. The questions to be asking yourself would be things like, well, what existing work or activities will can be reused for the own risk assessment for the aura? What additional work or activities need to be undertaken as part of it? What additional information will be needed as part of it? And also how much time is going to be needed to allow you to complete that process? We've got quite a long deadline, but careful planning is needed to make sure that everything's done on time. So that's the end of the webinar itself. We're now going to have a look, see what questions we've got. Right, I've got a few questions here to look at. Beverly, do you want to take the first couple of those? It's probably more your remit, and I'll pick up the last one.
Yeah, sure. So one question is, do we have to make the remuneration policy available to members if they request it? So this was something that was in the draft code in 2021, but one of the things that elicited some strong response, and it wasn't carried through to the final version of the code. The original version said you had to make it available on website and all that sort of thing. So there isn't, under the final version of the code, there isn't any obligation to make your remuneration policy public at all, or even available to members on request, but you can do so if you want to. The second question should schemes be putting a governance manual in place? So again, this is not something that is required under the general code. And as we've said already, there's no requirement to document every aspect of your scheme's ESOG. But you might just find it helpful to have all your ESOG related policies and processes in one place, so that you know where to find them. Typically you might have this held online on your administrator's document management system, so it's easily accessible and you know where to find it. But it's really just what works for you and your scheme. Giles, do you have another question to answer?
Yeah, I think it's back to me for that last question. So the last question, what's the penalty for not putting an ESOG in place? Well, there's no specific penalty for failing to comply with the requirement to have an ESOG. But the regulator, as I mentioned earlier, it could issue an improvement notice requiring trustees to take steps to put an ESOG in place. And if it was to do that, and then the trustees failed to comply with the improvement notice, then the next step would be the regulator could issue a penalty, which would be up to £5,000 for individual trustees and up to £50,000 for a corporate trustee. So there's no, probably in summary, there's no direct penalty, but there's a process, an indirect process the regulator could go through, which would very much incentivize trustees to comply if they're asked to by the regulator. So good question. Right, well, I think that, unless there are any new questions, which there aren't, I think that draws to a close this webinar. Just finally for us to say thank you very much for attending the webinar today. Hope you found it useful, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of day. Thank you.